I'm a 32-year-old guy, and I've always had a pretty close relationship with my younger sister, Daisy, who's 27. Growing up, I was the protective older brother, always looking out for her. It's been like that even after we moved out of our parents' house. Over the years, I've helped her with small things, covering for her when she was short on money, giving her advice when she was struggling with decisions, that sort of thing. Nothing too big, just what any older sibling would do. Daisy has always been kind of independent, but lately things have taken a turn for the worse. A few months ago, Daisy lost her job. It wasn't her fault, there were budget cuts, and she was let go along with a bunch of other people. She didn't have much saved up, and I could tell she was really struggling. She tried to stay positive at first, saying she'd find something new soon, but as the weeks went on, I could see the stress building. She was barely getting by, and eventually she fell behind on her rent. I knew Daisy wasn't the type to ask for help unless she really needed it, so when she called me in tears one evening, I wasn't surprised, but I was still worried. She told me she was 2 months behind on her rent, and that her landlord was threatening to evict her if she didn't pay up soon. It hit me hard. She was panicked, saying she had nowhere else to go, and I could hear the fear in her voice. She said this was a one-time emergency and promised she'd pay me back as soon as she got a new job. She just needed a bit of help to stay afloat. I've always been soft when it comes to Daisy, so I agreed to help her out. I figured it was just this one time, and she'd be more careful in the future. I told her that I'd send the money, but only if she promised to start being more responsible with her finances. She swore she would, and I transferred $1,500 to her account, enough to cover her overdue rent, and have a little extra left for groceries. Daisy was incredibly grateful. She texted me a bunch of times that night, thanking me and saying how relieved she was. She even mentioned that she had a job interview lined up for later that week, which made me feel like I was doing the right thing. She was trying, and I just needed to give her a bit of support during a tough time. For a few days after that, things seemed fine. Daisy was a lot happier. I noticed her posting on Instagram again, looking more upbeat than she had in weeks. At first, I thought it was a good sign, maybe things were turning around for her. She even posted about taking a self-care day, which seemed normal after all the stress she'd been through. But then I started noticing other things. Daisy wasn't picking up my calls as often, and when she didn't talk about her job hunt as much as I expected. Instead, she'd mention how she went out with friends or had dinner at some new restaurant in town. I didn't think too much of it at first, figuring she needed a bit of normalcy in her life. But then I saw something that really caught my attention. I was casually scrolling through Instagram one night and saw Daisy's stories. She wasn't just posting about hanging out with friends, she was flaunting shopping bags from expensive stores, tagging herself at high-end restaurants, and showing off what looked like brand new designer clothes. That was when my stomach dropped. This wasn't the Daisy I knew who was struggling to pay her rent. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I texted her, casually asking if she'd managed to pay her rent yet. Her response was vague. She said she was taking care of it, but quickly changed the subject, asking how I was doing instead. That's when the red flags started waving for me. Something wasn't adding up. Out of sheer concern, I decided to reach out to her landlord. I hated going behind her back like this, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't being completely honest with me. When I called the landlord, the conversation confirmed my worst fears. Daisy hadn't paid a dime of her overdue rent. She was still on the verge of eviction, and it didn't seem like she had made any arrangements to pay up. I felt sick. I had given her that money specifically to help with her rent, and instead she had used it for what? Clothes and fancy dinners? I couldn't believe it. After all the times I had helped her, I felt like she had completely taken advantage of my trust. I knew I couldn't just let this slide. It wasn't even about the money at this point, it was the betrayal. I had given her the benefit of the doubt, and she had lied to my face. I decided that I needed to confront her, face to face, and get to the bottom of it. So, that's where I'm at now. I'm planning to head over to her apartment later this week and talk to her directly. I don't know what I'm going to say yet, but I know I can't just let her keep digging herself into this hole. She needs to understand that this behavior isn't okay, and I'm done being the safety net she keeps falling back on. I just hope she listens. Update 1. So a few days after I found out from Daisy's landlord that she hadn't paid any rent, I decided it was time to confront her in person. I couldn't let this go. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the fact that she had completely lied to me. I helped her out of a tough spot, and she turned around and spent the money on God knows what. I wasn't even angry, just done. I needed to hear her explain it face to face. I went over to Daisy's apartment. When I got there, I could see from the outside that she was still living like everything was fine. There were shopping bags from stores I knew weren't cheap tossed around the living room, and she was wearing a brand new jacket I hadn't seen before. The whole place smelled like takeout from some fancy place, not the budget stuff someone struggling to pay rent would be eating. I felt a knot forming in my stomach, but I had to keep calm. I asked her straight up where the money went. At first, she tried to brush it off, acting like it wasn't a big deal. She said she had been taking care of things and was working on it, but I pressed her, and she started shifting uncomfortably, like she knew she couldn't dodge the questions anymore. After a bit of back and forth, she finally admitted that she'd used some of the money for other things. Daisy started talking fast, throwing out excuses. She said she had to buy new clothes because she needed to look professional for upcoming job interviews. Then she mentioned how she'd been under a lot of stress lately and needed to take care of herself mentally. According to her, a little retail therapy and some self-care were necessary after what she'd been through. She tried to justify it, saying that she couldn't focus on getting a job if she wasn't feeling good about herself. I stood there, just taking it all in. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I reminded her that I gave her that money to pay her rent, not to go on a shopping spree. Her landlord had already told me she hadn't paid a single cent, and she was still facing eviction. But Daisy just kept coming up with more excuses. She said she had a few interviews lined up, and if she got hired, she'd catch up on the rent next month. She didn't seem nearly as worried about the eviction as I was. That's when I told her, as calmly as I could, that I didn't trust her with money anymore. I'd always helped her because she was my sister and I cared about her. But this was different. I felt like I'd been completely taken advantage of. I wasn't just going to keep throwing money at her while she spent it on clothes and dinners. Daisy looked hurt when I said that. She started tearing up, saying I didn't understand what she was going through. She said things had been so hard for her and that she was trying her best. She made it sound like I was being the bad guy for not being more supportive, for not cutting her some slack when she needed it the most. She really laid it on thick, trying to make me feel guilty. But I wasn't falling for it this time. I stayed firm and told her that she needed to start taking responsibility for her actions. The money was meant to keep a roof over her head, and she blew it on personal luxuries. There was no way I could keep supporting her if this was how she was going to behave. That's when I gave her the ultimatum. I told her she had 1 week to figure out how to pay the overdue rent. If she didn't, I was cutting off all financial support. I wouldn't lend her another dollar no matter what. Daisy didn't argue as much as I expected. She just sort of nodded and said she'd do her best. But the lack of urgency in her voice made me doubt she really understood how serious this was. After I left her apartment, I couldn't help but feel conflicted. I vented to a few friends, and they all told me I'd done the right thing. Some even said I should have never given her the money in the first place. But part of me still felt like I'd been too harsh. I knew Daisy was going through a tough time, and I didn't want to kick her while she was down. But at the same time, I couldn't keep enabling her irresponsible behavior. A few days later, Daisy texted me saying that her job interviews hadn't gone as planned and that she was still looking for work. I didn't know whether to believe her or not. Something just felt off. So I decided to follow up with her landlord again to see if she'd made any payments at all. And unsurprisingly, she hadn't paid a dime. The landlord said Daisy was still behind and the eviction was getting closer. I felt a wave of frustration hit me. It was clear Daisy hadn't changed. She was still spending money on herself and ignoring the very real problem that she was about to get kicked out of her apartment. I wasn't sure what to do next, but I knew I couldn't keep bailing her out. At this point, it was up to her to figure it out. I'd done everything I could, and it was time for her to take responsibility for her own life. Update 2. A few days after our last conversation, Daisy called me out of the blue. I wasn't expecting much, but I thought maybe, just maybe, she had realized how bad things were getting. Maybe she was going to apologize or say she'd finally paid the rent. But that wasn't the case. She wasn't calling to explain anything. Instead, she asked me for more money. Not only was her rent still overdue, but now she had late fees piling up, and she needed extra to cover that too. I stood there holding my phone, trying to wrap my head around what I was hearing. I'd already given her $1,500, and she hadn't paid a cent of it toward her rent. I couldn't believe she had the nerve to ask for more. I cut her off and told her flat out that I wasn't giving her any more money. I'd helped her once, and it was her responsibility to figure things out from here. It wasn't on me to keep bailing her out when she had been spending the money on herself instead of her actual bills. That's when Daisy's tone changed. She didn't take no for an answer and started pleading. She said she'd be homeless if she didn't get the money soon. She tried to guilt me, saying that I was abandoning her when she needed me most. She was desperate, and I could hear it in her voice, but I wasn't budging this time. As if that wasn't enough, she started pulling at my emotions even more, telling me how she was struggling mentally. She said the stress was overwhelming her, that it was affecting her health, and that everything felt like it was spiraling out of control. She painted a picture of someone who was on the edge, and I'll admit, it was hard to hear. But deep down, I knew what she was doing. She was using her mental health as a way to get me to give her more money. I wasn't going to fall into that trap again. I told her that I couldn't help financially, but I was willing to help in other ways. I suggested we contact her landlord together to see if they could set up some kind of payment plan, or even ask for an extension. I offered to help her look into financial aid or other resources she might be able to tap into. But money? That was off the table. That's when she snapped. She called me selfish and cruel, saying that I cared more about money than my own family. She accused me of sabotaging her life, saying that without my help, she was going to end up on the streets. She was furious, and I could tell she wasn't going to listen to reason anymore. Feeling cornered, I warned her that if she didn't get her act together soon, I would have no choice but to distance myself completely. I wasn't going to let her drag me down with her poor decisions. I told her this was her last chance to sort things out before I cut off all contact. After that, she went quiet. I heard nothing from her for days. The silence was almost worse than the confrontation. I kept wondering if I should check in on her, but I resisted. This was her mess to clean up, and she needed to take responsibility for it. A few days later, I called her landlord to see if Daisy had made any payments. Unsurprisingly, she hadn't. The landlord told me that the eviction process was moving forward, and that if she didn't pay soon, she'd be out of the apartment. I felt a mix of guilt and resentment. On one hand, I didn't want to see my sister end up homeless. But on the other, I couldn't ignore the fact that she had abused my trust and wasted the money I'd given her. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the lies, the manipulation, and the complete disregard for how serious her situation really was. At this point, my parents started getting involved. They'd heard bits and pieces of the situation, but now they were offering their opinions. My mom thought I should help Daisy out more, that I was being too harsh, and that families should always support each other. My dad, on the other hand, said tough love was necessary. He agreed with me that Daisy needed to face the consequences of her actions. It didn't help that Daisy had been feeding them a different version of events, making it seem like she was just going through a rough patch and that I was being overly critical. I decided to give Daisy one more chance. I called her up and told her I was willing to help her negotiate with the landlord, but I wasn't giving her any more money. This was her chance to prove she was serious about fixing her situation. I expected her to be relieved, or at least appreciative, but instead she was cold. She told me she'd figure it out on her own and hung up. I knew from the tone of her voice that things weren't getting better. She was still spiraling, and I had no idea what she was going to do next. After talking to a few friends about everything, they all agreed that I needed to stand my ground. They told me I couldn't keep enabling her behavior, no matter how hard it was to watch. They supported my decision to set boundaries and reminded me that I'd already done more than enough. Still, the whole situation weighed on me. I didn't want to lose my relationship with Daisy, but I couldn't keep cleaning up her messes. I told her this was her final chance to take responsibility. If she didn't, I was ready to walk away. Now, I'm just waiting to see what happens next. Daisy's eviction is looming, and I don't know if she'll actually step up or let it all fall apart. Update 3. After a few days of silence, things escalated quickly, and not in a good way. My parents got more involved, and it turned into a full-blown family issue. I guess Daisy must have told them her side of the story, because out of nowhere, my mom started calling me, telling me that I needed to be more understanding. She kept saying things like family sticks together during tough times, and that I couldn't just abandon Daisy when she was clearly struggling. My dad chimed in too, although he was a bit more reserved than my mom. Still, the general message was the same. Daisy is the baby of the family, and I should be helping her out more. They told me I wasn't being supportive enough, and that I was putting her in a really tough position by refusing to give her more money. It felt like they were laying on the guilt pretty thick, trying to make me feel like I was the bad guy in all of this. Daisy, of course, had spun her own version of events. From what my parents were saying, she'd made it sound like she was just spending money on essentials and hadn't gone on any kind of shopping spree. She painted herself as someone who was just trying to get by, while I was apparently being overly harsh and unsympathetic. They had no idea about the Instagram posts, or the fact that she hadn't paid a single cent of her rent, despite the money I gave her. I decided enough was enough. I sat down with my parents and explained the full story. I told them how I had given Daisy $1,500, which was supposed to cover her overdue rent and some groceries, and instead she spent it on designer clothes and nights out at fancy restaurants. I laid out how I had called her landlord and found out she hadn't paid anything, and how she kept dodging my calls when I tried to get to the bottom of it. At first, my parents were shocked. They couldn't believe Daisy would do something like that. But then, almost immediately, my mom started making excuses for her. She said Daisy had been under a lot of stress, and sometimes people make bad decisions when they're feeling overwhelmed. She kept pushing the idea that I should just forgive Daisy and help her out again, because family is family. I could feel the tension rising. I wasn't going to cave in. I told them straight up that I wouldn't give Daisy any more money until she started taking responsibility for her actions. The way she'd handled things so far showed me she wasn't ready for help. She was just going to keep making the same mistakes over and over again. I thought I was being reasonable, but my parents didn't see it that way. My mom especially seemed frustrated, as if I was somehow in the wrong for not throwing more money at the problem. A few days after that conversation, Daisy reached out to me again. I thought maybe, just maybe, she was ready to apologize or at least acknowledge that she had messed up. But no, she had another plan in mind. She wasn't asking for an apology, she was asking me to co-sign a loan for her. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Daisy said she needed the loan to cover the rent and avoid eviction, and she wanted me to back her up on it. I didn't even hesitate. I refused immediately. There was no way I was putting my name on anything for her. I reminded her that she had proven she couldn't be trusted with money. I suggested, again, that she work something out with her landlord or look into government assistance programs, but she wasn't having any of it. That's when she really lost her temper. She accused me of trying to sabotage her life, saying that if I didn't help her, she'd end up homeless. She made it sound like I was intentionally pushing her toward rock bottom, like I wanted to see her fail. The whole conversation was a mess. A few days later, Daisy received the official eviction notice. She was getting kicked out of her apartment, and she blamed me for the entire situation. In her mind, it was my refusal to give her more money that caused all of this, not the fact that she had spent the money on luxuries instead of paying her rent. She wouldn't take any responsibility for her own actions. Things got even worse after that. My parents called me up again, but this time they weren't just pleading with me to help Daisy. They gave me an ultimatum: either I help her, or I would face further estrangement from the family. They were serious. My mom was especially upset, saying that I was being unfair and harsh by not stepping in to help my sister. They couldn't understand why I was holding my ground. To them, it was black and white. Daisy was family, and I should be doing everything I could to support her. I started to feel overwhelmed. The pressure from my parents was intense, and I couldn't help but question if I was doing the right thing. I vented to a few close friends about everything, and they reassured me that Daisy was clearly manipulating the situation. They reminded me that I had already gone above and beyond to help her, and that it wasn't my responsibility to fix all her problems. Still, I didn't want to risk getting dragged into any financial mess Daisy might create. I decided to consult a lawyer to make sure I wasn't liable for anything she did, especially with how unpredictable her behavior had become. The lawyer assured me that as long as I hadn't signed anything or agreed to any financial commitments, I was in the clear. That gave me some peace of mind, at least. In a final attempt to reason with her, I reached out to Daisy one more time. I told her I was willing to help her find affordable housing and work out a budget, but I wasn't giving her any more money. She refused. She told me that she shouldn't have to live like a poor person, and that was the end of that conversation. Then, the real bomb dropped. Daisy took everything to social media. She posted a long, dramatic rant about how I had abandoned her in her time of need. She painted me as the heartless brother who wouldn't help his struggling sister, and her post started getting a lot of attention. Strangers began to comment, calling me cold and selfish, all based on Daisy's one-sided version of events. It caused even more tension within the family. Now, I'm not just dealing with the fallout at home, but also the drama Daisy stirred up online. It feels like this situation keeps spiraling out of control, and I'm just waiting to see what happens next. Update 4. Daisy's social media posts started blowing up right after she aired out our family drama. I had a few friends text me, asking what was going on, and when I checked, I saw that Daisy had turned the whole situation into a public spectacle. She posted this long, emotional rant about how I had abandoned her during her most vulnerable time. She made it sound like I was heartless, like I just left her to fend for herself while she was on the verge of homelessness. She didn't mention any of the money I'd already given her or how she'd spent it on designer clothes and fancy meals. Of course, people were eating it up, sending her supportive comments and attacking me as the cold and selfish brother. Strangers, people who didn't even know us, were jumping in, calling me every name under the sun. They were completely buying into Daisy's version of events. It felt like a mob had formed, and I was the villain of her story. Some of the comments were brutal, saying things like, "I can't believe your own brother would do this to you, and you deserve better from your family." It was a nightmare, but I knew trying to defend myself online would just make things worse. My close friends rallied around me, though. They saw through Daisy's manipulation and told me not to engage with the social media mess. They reminded me that Daisy was using public sympathy as a tool, just like she had been using me. They told me to focus on protecting myself and my mental health, and that getting involved in an online back and forth would only give her more ammunition. So, I decided to ignore it. As hard as that was, I had to step back and let the situation play out. Things got even more complicated at home. My parents, who had already been leaning toward Daisy's side, started openly siding with her. They were disappointed in me for letting things get this far. My mom told me that I should apologize to Daisy, as if I was the one who had caused all of this. It felt like they were blind to what was really happening, that Daisy was manipulating everyone around her to get what she wanted. I tried to explain my side again, but it felt like talking to a wall. They were convinced that I had been too harsh, that I needed to step in and fix the mess. Despite everything that was happening online, Daisy still had the audacity to reach out to me privately, asking for more money. She said debt collectors were harassing her, and that she needed immediate cash to avoid getting sued. She didn't even mention the eviction that was hanging over her head. It was like she didn't care about how things had gotten so out of control, just that she needed a quick fix for her newest financial crisis. Around this time, I found out through a mutual acquaintance that Daisy's situation was even worse than I thought. Not only had she maxed out her credit cards, but she had taken out multiple payday loans to cover her shopping addiction. Everything was catching up to her, and it was clear that she was drowning in debt. She was spiraling fast, but instead of taking responsibility, she kept asking me, or anyone who would listen, for help. I started worrying about the legal side of things. What if she kept trying to get me involved in her financial mess? I didn't want to get roped into any of her debt or end up legally responsible for anything. So I spoke to a lawyer to get some advice. They reassured me that as long as I didn't co-sign anything or provide any financial support, I was in the clear. That was a huge relief. I knew I needed to protect my own stability, and hearing that from a lawyer helped me stand firm. Eventually, Daisy's eviction became official. She had nowhere to go, so she moved in with our parents temporarily. I felt guilty about it, but at the same time, I knew there was nothing more I could have done. I had given her the money to avoid this exact situation, and she had blown it. It wasn't my fault that things had turned out this way, even though it still felt terrible to watch it all unfold. Once she was living with my parents, things didn't get any better. Daisy started asking them for money too, saying she was going to get back on her feet soon, but showing no signs of changing her behavior. My parents, being who they are, gave in and started supporting her financially. But I could tell it was starting to take a toll on them. The strain was there, even if they didn't want to admit it. The breaking point came at a family gathering. Daisy confronted me in front of everyone, accusing me of ruining her life. She said I had never truly cared about her well-being, and that if I had, she wouldn't be in this situation. It was the most dramatic scene. She made herself out to be the victim once again. I had had enough. I told her, calmly but firmly, that I had done everything I could to help her, and that it was time for her to take responsibility for her own life. I made it clear that there would be no more financial assistance from me moving forward. She didn't take it well. She stormed out of the gathering, playing the victim card once again, and my parents just sat there, not knowing what to say. After that, the dynamic at home shifted. My parents started giving me the cold shoulder. Anytime we interacted, they'd make passive-aggressive comments about family loyalty and how I should have done more to help Daisy. It was like a constant guilt trip, and I could tell they blamed me for how everything had turned out. Meanwhile, Daisy kept up her vague, passive-aggressive social media posts, talking about fake family members who had abandoned her when she needed them most. It was exhausting, and I eventually decided to block her on all platforms. I couldn't keep letting her toxicity invade my life. My friends supported me through it all, reminding me to keep my boundaries and not give in to the manipulation. Now, I'm starting to accept that my relationship with Daisy, and maybe even my parents, will never go back to the way it was. It's painful, but I've come to terms with the fact that I can't fix this situation. I'm focusing on my own life and well-being now. That's the only thing I can control. Update 5. After Daisy's public meltdown on social media, things continued to unravel. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that Daisy had finally worn out her welcome at my parents' house. She'd been living there ever since her eviction, but the same old pattern repeated itself. She wasn't contributing or showing any signs of real change. From what I gathered, my parents had been giving her money, covering her expenses, and trying to help her get back on her feet, but she just took advantage of their generosity, much like she had with me. Eventually, they'd had enough, and she was back to couch surfing with friends. Hearing about this didn't surprise me, but it still hit hard. I didn't want to see my sister in that position, but I also knew that this was the consequence of her own actions. It seemed like she was spiraling further, refusing to take responsibility, and now the people who had bent over backward to support her were starting to feel the toll. My parents, especially my mom, were visibly stressed. They'd spent so much time and energy trying to help Daisy, but now it was clear that things weren't improving. I noticed that their health was starting to decline. My dad looked tired all the time, and my mom's emotional exhaustion was showing. They were beginning to realize just how much of a burden Daisy's irresponsibility had placed on them, both financially and emotionally. Still, they hadn't fully let go. Even though they were clearly drained, they kept holding on, enabling her in small ways because, in their eyes, she was still their baby. Watching all of this unfold from a distance was tough. Meanwhile, life for me was starting to move in a different direction. I got a promotion at work, which felt like a breath of fresh air. It was exactly the kind of distraction I needed to distance myself from the constant drama that Daisy had brought into my life. Focusing on my own success and stability made me realize how important it was to protect my mental health. I couldn't control what Daisy did, but I could control my own path. Then, one day, Daisy reached out again. This time, she apologized. She admitted that things had gotten out of hand and that she'd made a lot of mistakes. She said she was in therapy now and trying to get her life back on track. She even hinted that she was sorry for how much hurt she had caused, but of course she also mentioned that she was still struggling with some financial problems and asked if I could help her out just this once. It was like she hadn't learned anything from the last few months. I took a deep breath and told her, calmly but firmly, that while I was glad she was getting help, I wouldn't be giving her any more money. I offered emotional support and told her I hoped she was serious about turning her life around, but I made it crystal clear that I wasn't going to enable her anymore. No more financial assistance. She needed to figure things out on her own this time. That conversation was a turning point for me. I realized just how much damage had been done, not only by Daisy's actions but by the years of enabling her. The toxic family dynamics, the constant back and forth, the manipulation, it had all affected me more than I wanted to admit. So I decided to start therapy myself. It became clear that I needed to process everything that had happened and work on setting stronger boundaries, especially with my family. Therapy helped me see that while I loved my family, I couldn't keep getting pulled into their unhealthy patterns. My relationship with my parents was still strained, but there were small signs that they were starting to see the bigger picture. They hadn't fully cut Daisy off, but they were beginning to admit that they had enabled her behavior for far too long. It was a small step, but at least they were starting to wake up to the reality of the situation. Daisy, on the other hand, continued to reach out every now and then. She'd message me, trying to rebuild our sibling relationship, but I stayed cautious. I'd seen this pattern too many times before. She'd claimed she was getting her life together, but it never lasted. I knew I couldn't let myself get pulled back into her drama, so I kept firm boundaries in place. If she truly changed, I was open to mending things, but until then, I had to protect my own peace. There was one conversation with my parents that stuck with me. It was just the three of us, and for the first time, they seemed to really acknowledge how much they had contributed to the situation by constantly bailing Daisy out. My mom even said that she regretted not seeing the full picture sooner. They weren't ready to fully cut her off, but they admitted that they'd let things go on for too long. It was a bittersweet moment. On one hand, it felt good to hear them finally admit it, but on the other, I wish they had realized it before things had gotten so bad. As for Daisy, she kept claiming she was working on her rehabilitation, but I remained skeptical. I wanted to believe she was finally making real changes, but after everything, I knew better than to get my hopes up. I wasn't going to be sucked back into the cycle of enabling her. I had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to let them face the consequences of their own choices. In the end, I realized how much I'd grown from the whole ordeal. It wasn't easy, but I had learned the importance of setting boundaries, even with family. I couldn't fix Daisy's problems, and I wasn't responsible for her mistakes. What I could do was focus on my own life, my own goals, and my own happiness. While the family dynamic was still damaged, I felt like there was a slow process of healing happening. It wasn't perfect, and it might never be the same, but I was cautious and hopeful. Most importantly, I had finally found a sense of peace and clarity, knowing that I had done everything I could and that the rest was up to Daisy. I'm a 30-year-old guy, and I've always been close to my sister Olivia, who's 32. We grew up in a typical middle-class family, the kind where you always felt like everything was going to be okay. Our parents worked hard to give us a stable, comfortable life without a lot of extras. Our home was modest but warm, filled with a lot of love and family traditions that made everything feel more special. Growing up, Olivia and I were close. We had the usual sibling fights and competition, but I always felt like she had my back, and I had hers. Then, 2 years ago, everything changed. Our parents were killed in a car accident, just like that. We were left with the shock, the grief, and on top of that, the responsibilities that come with losing the people who held everything together. Our parents left us their small house and a modest inheritance. It wasn't a fortune, just something to give us a bit of a start in life. The inheritance was split evenly between Olivia and me. That's what our parents had always said they would do, and it was laid out that way in their will. I didn't think much about it, it seemed fair, and I trusted that our parents knew best. But Olivia wasn't happy with the arrangement. She felt like she deserved more than an equal share, and she wasn't shy about letting me know. Now, I should explain something about Olivia and our roles in the family, at least from her perspective. In the last few years of our parents' lives, Olivia spent more time around them than I did. Not that she was their full-time caregiver or anything, but she lived closer, and she did a lot of the small errands, taking them to appointments, things like that. I know she did it out of love, but she's always talked about it as though she'd made some big sacrifice. It was as if she had put her life on hold to look after them, though. From my perspective, she still had a pretty active social life and was living fairly well. When we first sat down to discuss the inheritance, Olivia brought all this up, how she had sacrificed so much, while I was busy with my job and my life in another city. I didn't know how to respond. She was making it sound like she'd been working as their live-in nurse or something, but really she was living her life, just with a few added responsibilities here and there. She talked about how she'd given up on career opportunities to help them, and how I should recognize her sacrifices by giving her more of the inheritance. She had all these examples lined up, and it was obvious she had been thinking about this for a long time. One thing that surprised me, though, was when she brought up her debt. Apparently, Olivia had been living on credit cards and loans for years. She hadn't mentioned it before, so I assumed everything was fine, but now she was saying she needed more of the inheritance because of her debt. She argued that since she had made sacrifices for our parents, it was only fair that I help her out. She didn't want me to just give her my half outright, but she was hinting that I should at least consider her financial struggles. I'm not going to lie, it was awkward. Olivia has always had a different relationship with money than I have. I've been careful, living within my means, saving up, and thinking about the future. Meanwhile, Olivia has always lived a bit more lavishly, spending on things that didn't seem necessary. We all have different ways of living, and I don't judge her for it, but it made her demands feel strange to me. Why should my portion of the inheritance cover her credit card debt, especially when I had been careful with my finances? As time went on, Olivia's hints became more direct. She started saying things like families should support each other, and if the roles were reversed, I'd help you. She'd drop these comments at family gatherings, saying she deserved more for all she'd given up for our parents. Then, one night, it all came to a head. We were at a family dinner, just a few of our close relatives, and Olivia brought it up again. She raised her voice, talking about how she had given up her prime years to help our parents, and now she was drowning in debt. She wasn't just talking to me at that point, she was addressing the whole room, hoping to get everyone on her side. At first, our relatives stayed out of it. They listened quietly, probably uncomfortable with the whole scene. But the more Olivia talked about her sacrifices and how selfish it was of me to not offer her more, the more they started nodding along. By the end of the night, a few of them were murmuring in agreement, looking at me like maybe I was the one being unreasonable. It felt like I was suddenly the bad guy, just for wanting to keep what our parents had left us, what they had intended for both of us, equally. After that, things were tense. Olivia would barely speak to me, and when she did, it was usually to make another comment about how family should stick together, or how I wouldn't be where I am without all the help our parents gave us. It wasn't like her to be so confrontational, but it was clear that she wasn't going to let this go. A close friend of mine, who knew what was happening, advised me not to give in. They warned me that if I let her guilt me into giving up my inheritance, it wouldn't stop there. Olivia would just keep finding reasons why I owed her something, and I'd be dealing with this for the rest of my life. I knew they were right, but it didn't make things any easier. After a while, I started wondering if there was anything I could do legally to protect my share of the inheritance. It felt strange to even think about it that way, but with Olivia pressuring me every chance she got, I figured it was better to know my rights than get blindsided down the line. So, I went to a lawyer just to get some advice on how the inheritance split worked and what options I had. That decision, though, ended up creating more problems than I could have imagined. Update 1. After the lawyer consultation, I was still feeling the weight of Olivia's ongoing demands, and I figured I'd see what others thought about my situation. I posted about it on Reddit, detailing the inheritance issues, her constant pressure, and the family taking her side. It was mostly to get a fresh perspective, maybe some advice on how to handle it without causing an even bigger rift. I didn't expect much, but the post took off. People were chiming in with all kinds of opinions, a lot of them supporting me, others suggesting compromises. Some said I was right to hold firm. Others thought I should give her something extra for the sake of family harmony. A day later, I found out Olivia had seen the post. She messaged me, furious, saying I had crossed a line by airing our private family issues online. It seemed like she wasn't just mad about the post itself, she saw it as a public betrayal. Soon after, she took things straight to our family group chat. She announced to everyone that I'd gone online to drag her through the mud in front of strangers, framing me as someone out to ruin her reputation just to make myself look good. It didn't take long for family members to jump in, asking why I would do something like that. Some accused me of turning our family drama into entertainment for the internet, while others messaged me privately saying they were disappointed. It was overwhelming. I was barely able to keep up with the responses pouring in, some from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Messages kept popping up saying things like family should be kept private, and you should try harder to understand what Olivia has gone through. Amid all this, a friend who knew Olivia and I pretty well reached out to me with some information I didn't see coming. They told me that Olivia's financial situation had been a lot worse than I realized, even before our parents passed. She had a history of overspending, buying things she couldn't afford, and racking up debt without much thought. I had no idea she'd always seemed to have everything under control. Hearing this changed how I saw things. This wasn't just about her wanting more of the inheritance because of her sacrifices. It was about her seeing the inheritance as a quick fix for the years of debt she'd quietly piled up. But even with this knowledge, the pressure kept building. I was starting to worry, wondering how much longer I could handle this without giving in. I'd been counting on my inheritance as part of my financial future, especially since I'd always been cautious with money, saving up and planning ahead. Giving up part of it now would throw my plans off balance. One of my aunts suggested bringing in a family mediator. I didn't know what to expect, but I agreed, hoping it might help settle things in a fair way. We set up the first session, and it turned out to be more intense than I'd expected. Olivia came prepared, carrying what looked like a written list of all the sacrifices she claimed to have made for our parents. She listed everything out: vacations she supposedly missed, job opportunities she'd turned down, even nights out with friends she'd skipped, all to help with our parents. As she read through the list, I couldn't believe how detailed it was. She'd turned ordinary tasks into major sacrifices, things anyone would do for their parents without a second thought. The mediator tried to encourage us to find common ground, suggesting that we might be able to reach a compromise, but the whole thing felt one-sided. It was clear that Olivia wasn't backing down from her belief that she deserved more than me, and I was feeling like the mediator was leaning toward her side, probably because of the way she framed her sacrifices. At one point in the session, Olivia gave an emotional speech, talking about how lost she felt after our parents' passing, and how this inheritance was her only chance to recover from all she'd been through. It was dramatic, and I could see the mediator's expression soften, like they felt sorry for her. But to me, it felt like another attempt to guilt me into giving up my share. After that session, I started to wonder if I needed a second opinion on the legal side of things. I met with another lawyer to confirm what I already knew, that I wasn't legally obligated to give Olivia any more than what our parents had left her. The lawyer reassured me that my portion was secure, and that no amount of emotional pleas or family pressure could change what our parents had set in stone. That didn't stop Olivia, though. Not long after the second lawyer meeting, she confronted me directly, accusing me of being heartless and abandoning her in her time of need. She framed it as if I was the one breaking up the family by holding on to my inheritance, trying to make me look like the bad guy in all this. Feeling overwhelmed, I turned back to Reddit, posting an update about how everything was unfolding. People responded with even more advice, warning me about the guilt tripping and suggesting I set clear boundaries. It was encouraging to see that others thought I wasn't in the wrong, but it didn't make it easier to stand my ground in real life. The pressure from family was relentless, and Olivia's accusations were starting to weigh on me. After thinking it over, I decided I had to stand firm. This was what our parents had wanted, and it was my right to honor their wishes. I wasn't going to let Olivia's spending habits or her guilt-tripping tactics change what I knew was fair. No matter how uncomfortable it made things with the family, I resolved to keep my share of the inheritance and protect the future I'd been working toward. The fallout wasn't over, but at least I'd made my decision. Update 2. After I decided to hold my ground on the inheritance, Olivia's persistence escalated in ways I wasn't prepared for. She started contacting me every day, sometimes multiple times a day, switching between begging for help and accusing me of abandoning family. Her messages poured in: texts, voicemails, even long emails outlining how she sacrificed everything while I supposedly just reaped the benefits. One moment she'd be pleading, talking about how much she needed the money, and the next, she'd throw in a threat, saying she'd find a way to get what she deserved if I wouldn't do the right thing. Not long after that, I started noticing that several family members were now openly siding with her. Cousins, a few aunts, and even some extended relatives reached out, either to check in or subtly remind me about all Olivia has done. They'd say things like, she really did give up a lot, or, it would be easier for everyone if you just gave her a bit more. I'd hear things like, she's family, can't you just help her out? The repetition, coming from all angles, made it feel like there was no escape. It was exhausting. Meanwhile, Olivia took her frustrations to social media. She didn't name me directly, but she posted these vague, dramatic statuses about betrayal and being let down by the people who should be there the most. Friends and extended family started chiming in under her posts, offering sympathy and validation. Her updates attracted a lot of attention, and pretty soon I started getting direct messages from people asking what was going on and why I wasn't helping my sister in her time of need. A part of me wanted to respond, but I knew anything I said would only fuel the fire. The pressure didn't just come through social media. My aunt and uncle, who I hadn't heard from in months, gave me a call, saying they were concerned about the family. They urged me to think about what our parents would have wanted and how family was more important than money. They didn't outright say it, but the implication was clear. They believed I was being selfish, and it felt like they wanted me to just cave in to keep the peace. Thankfully, not everyone was piling on. My close friends knew the whole story and kept supporting me. They encouraged me to stick with my decision, reminding me that I wasn't responsible for Olivia's financial issues or her choices. They were the only people who seemed to understand the constant pressure I was facing, and without their support, I don't know how I would have managed to hold up. After a while, I started wondering if there was any middle ground, something that might satisfy her without leaving me in a difficult position. I thought about offering her a loan, something she could use to settle her debts without me giving up any part of the inheritance. It felt like a fair compromise, but at the same time, I worried it could set a dangerous precedent. If I gave her a loan now, would she just keep coming back for more, claiming it wasn't enough? I decided to give it a try, hoping it would show her I was willing to meet halfway. When I brought it up, though, Olivia wasn't having it. She rejected the loan immediately, saying that a loan wasn't enough and she needed real security, which, in her mind, meant outright ownership of a bigger share of the inheritance. The rejection felt like a dead end. She wasn't interested in compromises, she wanted control, plain and simple. Seeing that she wouldn't budge, I ran the numbers again to see how much losing a larger portion of the inheritance would impact me. It was frustrating to realize just how much it would throw off my financial plans. I'd been careful for years, saving and investing, and this inheritance was supposed to help secure my future. Giving her a bigger chunk would mean readjusting all of that. I went back to Reddit for advice, updating everyone on the recent developments. Most people warned me that giving in would only embolden Olivia to keep demanding more. They encouraged me to set boundaries, even if it meant some family members would be unhappy. Their responses helped reinforce my decision, but I was still dealing with the daily fallout of Olivia's persistence and the family pressure. At that point, I knew I needed more support than just Reddit and friends. I decided to book a few sessions with a therapist. They helped me see the situation more objectively, emphasizing that it was okay to protect my own interests, even if it upset some family members. They also pointed out that Olivia's approach wasn't just about her needs, it was a form of manipulation. Realizing this was a turning point for me. Olivia wasn't just asking for help, she was trying to guilt-trip me into submission. Olivia, however, wasn't done escalating. She started saying that if I didn't give her what she wanted, she'd bring even more family into the situation, painting me as heartless and greedy. I could see the divide she was creating, and it was putting a strain on everyone involved. Family gatherings started feeling tense, with people giving me sideways looks or trying to steer the conversation to resolving things with Olivia. The tipping point came at a family birthday celebration. Olivia brought up the inheritance in front of everyone, accusing me of caring more about money than family. She went on about her sacrifices and how I was abandoning her, practically performing for the entire room. The confrontation was uncomfortable for everyone, and people shuffled awkwardly, trying to avoid looking directly at us. Some family members seemed embarrassed, others quietly nodded along with her. I was caught off guard and barely got a word in before Olivia stormed out, leaving everyone else in stunned silence. After that incident, I started seriously considering going no contact with Olivia, and maybe even with some of the relatives who were fueling the drama. The constant pressure was exhausting, and I realized that my life would be better if I set firm boundaries, even if it meant stepping back from people who couldn't respect my choices. Update 3. After that dramatic family gathering, I decided to go no contact with Olivia. Her constant attempts to guilt-trip me, the social media jabs, and the public outbursts had all become too much. I blocked her on every platform, thinking that maybe a period of silence would help things cool down. I figured some distance would not only help me regain my sanity but might also show her that this pressure wasn't going to make me fold. It was exhausting trying to keep up with her constant messaging, so cutting off contact felt like the only way forward. But instead of bringing peace, the silence brought new issues. Soon, a few relatives started giving me the cold shoulder following Olivia's lead. At family gatherings, they'd barely acknowledge me, making it clear whose side they were on. A few wouldn't respond to my messages or calls, while others who did interact were brief and distant, like I was some stranger they had to tolerate. It was strange seeing people I'd known all my life suddenly switch off over an inheritance dispute. There was no hiding their disapproval. Then, out of nowhere, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. It was from Olivia. She'd written me an apology letter. At first, I thought maybe she was actually reaching out to make amends, but as I read it, it was clear this wasn't a genuine apology. She talked about her sacrifices in detail, repeating the same stories of missed opportunities and time spent helping our parents. She framed it as if she'd been their sole caregiver, taking on all their burdens without any support. Every line had a hint of guilt in it, as if she was trying to remind me that I was somehow in debt to her. Not long after, I met with my lawyer again, and this time he brought up a concern. He warned that there was a chance Olivia could try to take the inheritance issue to court, claiming some form of entitlement based on her significant contributions. He was clear that her case was weak, and she'd have little to no chance of winning, but it could still become a long, expensive ordeal if she decided to push it. This wasn't what I wanted. Fighting my own sister in court wasn't something I'd ever imagined, but I had to be prepared for anything at this point. Around that time, a few family members reached out, suggesting we give mediation another try. Even though the first session had been a mess, I reluctantly agreed. If a second attempt could settle things, maybe it was worth it to just get this whole issue behind us. But as soon as we sat down with the mediator, it was obvious that nothing had changed. Olivia was still convinced that she deserved more. The mediator tried to get us to focus on clear boundaries, suggesting that we needed a final decision to avoid more arguments. But Olivia's demands were the same, and she wasn't willing to meet halfway. After the failed mediation, I decided to make one final offer as a last-ditch effort to resolve things. I told her I'd give her a small, one-time payout as a gesture of goodwill. It was a fair sum, more than I felt obligated to give, but enough to help her out. I was hoping this would satisfy her and let both of us move on with our lives. Olivia's response was immediate and outraged. She found the offer insulting and claimed she deserved everything. It was clear that she wanted to take as much as she could get, and she wouldn't settle for less. At this point, it felt like there was no winning with her, and no amount of money would be enough to satisfy her demands. Things only got worse when extended family members decided to jump in. I started receiving messages from a few of them, giving me ultimatums, either help Olivia or risk being cut off. They pressured me, saying things like, think of the family or you're tearing everyone apart. It was exhausting, and every new message felt like another push to just give in for the sake of peace. But I knew that giving in wouldn't fix anything. It would only validate her sense of entitlement and invite more demands down the line. With everything that had happened, I started reflecting on whether I was wrong for wanting to protect my future. Therapy sessions had been a lifeline for me, helping me process all the guilt Olivia was trying to pile on. Through those sessions, I began to see the relationship with Olivia for what it was, emotionally toxic. She wasn't just asking for help, she was using family and guilt as tools to get what she wanted, without any concern for the impact on my life. By now, I was fully committed to protecting my inheritance. My parents had left it to both of us equally, and that was what I intended to honor. I wasn't going to let Olivia's manipulation or the pressure from extended family sway me from doing what I believed was right. This was about standing up for myself, something I hadn't realized I'd need to do so strongly with my own family. After deciding to hold firm, I posted one final update on Reddit, detailing everything that had happened since the start. The Reddit community's support was overwhelming, reminding me that I wasn't alone in dealing with difficult family dynamics. Many people shared similar stories, and their encouragement made me feel more confident about my choice. I shared my final decision to protect my inheritance and move forward, regardless of Olivia's reaction or the family's judgment. With that, I finally felt a sense of closure. It had been a draining, painful process, but I was ready to focus on my own life, separate from the constant family drama. I knew that some relationships might never return to normal, but I was okay with that. It was time to prioritize my own well-being and move on, ready to rebuild and look forward without letting anyone else dictate my future. Update 4. Just when I thought things were finally quieting down, a formal letter arrived at my door. It was from Olivia's lawyer, demanding a larger share of the inheritance. She claimed that her significant contributions and sacrifices over the years entitled her to more than what our parents had originally designated. Seeing her take this route felt like a punch to the gut. I couldn't believe she was willing to escalate things to the point of legal action, and the timing couldn't have been worse. I was already drained from the months of family drama and tension. I immediately reached out to my lawyer, who reviewed Olivia's claim. He was clear that her case was weak. The will explicitly stated an equal split, and legally, that was the final word. But he also warned me that if she decided to take this to court, it would be costly and emotionally draining, no matter how straightforward it seemed on paper. Even with a weak case, her persistence could turn this into a drawn-out battle that would take a toll on me. News of Olivia's lawsuit spread fast. Before I knew it, family members were texting and calling, some urging me to just make things easier by giving her what she wanted. Others were more cautious, suggesting I find a peaceful solution rather than dragging the family through a public legal fight. It felt like the earlier tensions were all flaring up again, but this time, everyone seemed to have an opinion on how I should handle it. I was facing pressure from people I hadn't heard from in years, and it only added to the sense of isolation. Then Olivia took her campaign to social media. She didn't just hint at it this time, she laid it all out, sharing her side of the story with her followers. She painted a picture of herself as the dutiful daughter who'd given up everything, while I, the selfish sibling, refused to help. Her posts gained traction quickly, with people commenting their support, some even saying things like, "You deserve better and how could family treat you this way?" It wasn't long before strangers started messaging me directly. Some demanded explanations, others scolded me for abandoning my sister. There were messages from people telling me to reconsider and make things right, as if they understood the full story from her few carefully chosen words. I could see what Olivia was doing. She was framing the situation to make herself look like a victim, drawing in sympathy, and trying to push me into a corner. The constant online harassment started affecting my sleep and honestly my mental health. I was already worn out from the past months of arguments, mediation attempts, and family conflicts. Now, on top of that, I had strangers judging me based on her posts. I began to feel on edge all the time, knowing that my phone could light up with another message, another accusation, any minute. It was overwhelming, and I could feel the stress creeping into every part of my life. Thankfully, my friends were a huge support during this time. They rallied around me, reminding me that Olivia's tactics were manipulative and that I had every right to protect my inheritance. They encouraged me to focus on my future and to not let her social media campaign get under my skin. Their words helped ground me, but the stress was still there, and it felt like I was fighting a losing battle. In a follow-up meeting with my lawyer, he suggested making a counteroffer to settle things out of court. It wasn't what I wanted, but he thought it might be the best way to avoid a lengthy, costly court case. Reluctantly, I agreed. We drafted a modest settlement proposal, not what she was demanding, but a sum that could help her out without compromising my own financial plans. It felt unfair to even consider it, but if it ended this nightmare, it might be worth it. When we sent the offer over, Olivia's response was exactly what I'd expected. She immediately rejected it, calling it insulting and saying she was entitled to much more. Her reaction was more than just a refusal. She amped up her campaign, posting about how I was trying to buy her off with a pathetic sum, using the situation to fuel her narrative of being the wrong sibling. As more family members heard about the offer and Olivia's response, the divide within the family only deepened. Some relatives were quick to tell me to just give Olivia what she wants, claiming it would bring peace to the family. Others stayed neutral, not wanting to get involved but quietly implying that this was all unnecessary. With each call and message, it felt like people were forgetting that I hadn't started this dispute, and that it was Olivia who'd turned things into a public spectacle. In another discussion, my lawyer advised me to set a strict deadline for Olivia to accept the offer before we proceeded with any legal actions to protect my inheritance. We agreed to send her one final notice, giving her a week to respond. After that, I'd be taking the steps needed to put an end to this, one way or another. At this point, I started seriously considering what my future relationship with Olivia would look like if this dragged on any longer. The more I thought about it, the more it became clear that the only way forward might be to cut her off entirely. If she was willing to publicly attack me and try to manipulate family members, maybe a clean break was the only way to truly move on. Exhausted and frustrated, I posted an update on Reddit. I shared everything that had happened since the initial post, the lawsuit, the social media campaign, the rejected offer, and the family pressure. I didn't expect much, but the responses were full of people who'd been through similar family battles. Many urged me to hold my ground, warning me that giving in would only encourage Olivia's entitlement and make it worse. Seeing others' stories and their advice helped me feel less alone and more certain of my decision. Now, with the deadline set, I'm more determined than ever to protect my inheritance and end this once and for all. It's clear that Olivia won't stop unless I draw a firm line. This situation has taken a toll on me, but I'm ready to move on regardless of the fallout. It's time to prioritize my own peace and look forward without letting anyone dictate my future. Update 5. The deadline for Olivia to accept the settlement offer came and went without a word from her. I wasn't surprised, but it was still a turning point. With no response, my lawyer and I moved ahead to prepare for court proceedings. I'd already resolved to see this through, but having the legal wheels in motion made it feel real. It was no longer a family argument. It was becoming a legal dispute with all the consequences that came with it. Then, just as we were getting everything ready, Olivia reached out at the last minute. She wanted to settle after all, but tried to renegotiate the terms, angling for a bit more than what I'd initially offered. She suggested that if I just adjusted the amount slightly, we could avoid court and the family could heal. But by then, I was done with compromise. I told her the offer remained exactly as it had been when I first proposed it. It was a take it or leave it deal, and if she didn't want it, I was fully prepared to proceed. Faced with my stance, Olivia finally agreed, though it was clear she wasn't happy about it. She accepted the settlement, but not without plenty of bitter comments and remarks about what could have been if I just valued family more. It was as if she wanted me to feel guilty right to the very end. But despite her complaints, the agreement was signed, and the inheritance dispute was officially over. For the first time in what felt like forever, I had legal closure and a sense of peace, knowing that this particular battle was finally behind me. Family reactions, of course, were mixed. Some relatives, still loyal to Olivia's side, distanced themselves, showing no interest in reconciling. A few family members expressed their disappointment, implying that I should have given her everything she wanted just to keep things smooth. But there were also a few quiet messages from other relatives apologizing for how things had spiraled. They hadn't wanted to take sides, they said, but they respected my decision. It felt strange to see the family so split, yet freeing to finally be able to walk away from the drama with no lingering legal ties. On social media, Olivia's posts started to fade out. It seemed like her followers lost interest without the constant updates, and soon enough, her campaign of exposing the truth about me disappeared. I never saw an apology from her, not in any form, but the silence was honestly enough. It was almost as if her public rants had finally run out of steam, and she was moving on too. After everything, Olivia and I went completely no contact. It happened gradually but naturally. With the settlement done, there wasn't anything else to discuss, and neither of us made an effort to reach out. It was strange at first, knowing that I'd probably never speak to her again, but as time passed, I found myself feeling lighter, more in control. The no contact was more than just a break from the conflict. It was a relief, a newfound freedom I hadn't realized I needed. Looking back, I could see how the family dynamics had shifted permanently. I'd lost some connections, yes, but I'd also protected myself from being taken advantage of. The decision was hard and painful, but I understood that standing up for my own future was necessary. I didn't owe anyone a part of my financial security just because we were related. With therapy and introspection, I found a renewed sense of self-worth. For the first time, I was starting to see the importance of boundaries. Therapy helped me realize that family doesn't mean unlimited access to someone's life or finances. Olivia had crossed a line, and no one, not even family, had the right to guilt me into sacrificing my future for their mistakes. With the drama finally behind me, I could focus on my goals again. I took my half of the inheritance and invested wisely, setting up a solid financial foundation that would support me long-term. It was satisfying to finally use it as my parents intended, securing my future without having to constantly justify my choices to someone else. I also set aside a portion as a savings cushion for emergencies, something I hadn't been able to do before. Knowing that I was financially stable brought a sense of calm I hadn't felt in a long time. My friendships also deepened through all of this. My friends had stuck by me through every twist, showing up as my real support system when family ties were at their most fragile. Their support was a constant reminder that there were people who valued me for who I was, not what I could give them. These friendships were strengthened, and I felt lucky to have them in my life, especially as I started rebuilding my trust in others. To close this chapter, I posted a final reflection on Reddit. I thank the community for their support and advice throughout this ordeal. The comments and messages from people who'd been through similar situations had been a huge source of strength, helping me see that I wasn't alone. I shared the lessons I'd learned about boundaries, family, and standing up for myself, hoping it might help someone else in a similar position. Moving forward, I've embraced the importance of boundaries. In every future relationship, family or otherwise, I know that respect and mutual support are essential. I won't allow anyone, regardless of the connection, to make me feel guilty for protecting what's mine. This experience has changed me, but in a way that I believe has made me stronger, more self-assured, and ready to move on without letting the past dictate my future.